Thank you so much. It's such a great pleasure to be here, and my appreciation to Dan Cotton and to the Dean for inviting me here. And I'd like to begin by telling you a little secret about myself. I just love to watch people. I just love it, right? So I have to tell you about the most interesting person I have ever watched. And this was when I was working down in Antarctica. And this guy, his name was Neil. And Neil was just a little guy. He had kind of a big head, so he looked like this upside down exclamation point. And what Neil used to like to do, Neil was the best mimic I have ever known in my life. He could mimic almost anybody. And he had a thin, wispy little voice. Now, the station manager, on the other hand, was this hulk of a man, 6'8", a deep baritone voice. And what Neil, the little guy, used to do is whenever the phone on station would ring, he'd pick it up and he'd say, "Hello, this is Art Brown speaking," in a perfect imitation of the station manager's voice. Station manager's Art Brown. So one day, phone rings, Neil picks it up. "Hello, this is Art Brown speaking." And it was Art Brown on the other end of the line. So Art says, "Who the hell is this?" or words to that effect. And Neil says, "Why, Art, this is you. I'm so glad you finally gotten in touch with yourself." And so that's actually what we're going to be doing here today. We're going to be helping you to get in touch with one of the deepest aspects that you have as a human being, and that is your ability to learn. Now, just to give you a little bit more background about myself, I grew up moving all over the United States. So by the time I'd hit 10th grade, I'd lived in 10 different places. Now, the thing is, if you are, mathematics is an incredibly sequential subject. So if you fall off anywhere along the line, it's really hard to get back on. So I fell off, as it turns out, when I was moving from Lubbock, Texas to Chelmsford, Massachusetts when I was about 7 years old. They were suddenly way far ahead of me in the multiplication tables. I wasn't really fast with the multiplication tables anyway. I couldn't keep up. They were just going further and further ahead, and I wasn't, right? Because I just couldn't catch up with them. And so as a consequence, I basically flunked my way through elementary, middle, and high school math and science, which is kind of funny, a little ironic, since I am indeed standing here in front of you today as a professor of engineering. And I'm the real deal. I publish in, very good journals, and I'm teaching statistics and probability, teach thermo circuits, you name it. And the thing is, one day, one of my students found out about my sort of sordid past as a math flunky, and he asked me, he said, "How did you do it? How did you change your brain?" And I thought about it, and I mean, here I was this little kid. This is like the last cute picture of me. So but as you can tell, I just loved animals. That was a Barbados sheep, and I love kind of soft, and I like knitting, and I liked kind of all the typical little girl things, and so the thing is, I knew I couldn't do math and science, and so I had one dream growing up, and that was, hey, what if I could actually learn another language? I mean, I grew up in a resolutely monolingual household, and you can guess which language that was. And I just thought, wouldn't it be really awesome if I could learn to speak another language? So at that time, there were not college loans available, and I didn't know how to learn another language, except I found out there was one way I could learn another language and actually get paid for it, and that was to join the Army. So that's me looking really nervous, about to throw a grenade, and if you knew how clumsy I was, you would know why I looked so nervous. But I did learn another language. I learned Russian, and I ended up working out on Soviet trawlers up in the Bering Sea, and I'm standing there on a bunch of fish. And I just love seeing the world through new perspectives and having new adventures. And so I also ended up at the South Pole Station in Antarctica, and that's where I met my husband. So I always say I had to go to the end of the earth to meet that man. And it's 32 years. The best decision I ever made was saying yes to that man. But the thing is, so here I was 26 years old, about to get out of the Army, and I began to realize something. I had one sole professional expertise, and that was the ability to speak Russian. And guess what? There's just like not much call for people who speak Russian. So I looked around me in society, and I began to realize that language and culture are incredibly important, and they've always been important, and they always will be important. But today, increasingly, math and science and technology are also important. And so I thought, I'm supposed to be open to new perspectives and new adventures. Hey, and besides, what's more alien to me than something like engineering, And so, I'd look at some of those equations and say, no, but wait a minute, doesn't that look like a foreign language, right? So at 26, I decided to start trying to see if I could retrain my brain. And it was not easy. I had to go all the way back to remedial high school algebra. And if you looked at my old books from those days, they'd have all these dimples in the pages. And you might say, why are these dimples in your pages? And it's because when I'd get so frustrated, I'd take a fork and I'd stab the book, right? But how many of our students also feel those same kinds of frustrations when they're tackling some of the new ideas that we're trying to present to them? So if I'd known then what I know now, I could have made it much easier on myself. And so as I began to try to answer, when that student asked that question, how did you change your brain? I thought, I'll write a book. Right? I like to write books, so why don't I just write a little book? It'll be easy, quick. That's what we always think. It's good that we fool ourselves that way. But so I put together a manuscript, and then, has anybody heard of this website called ratemyprofessors.com? So I went to that website, and there's a way you can figure out to download the top instructors in like engineering, science, technology, physics, mathematics, economics, you name it. You can download the top hundreds of professors in those disciplines. So I did. I got like thousands and thousands of names, and I got all their emails. And I emailed these people and said, hey, would you mind taking a look at the manuscript for this book that I'm writing? And to my shock, a huge percentage of these individuals wanted to take a look, which was kind of made a lot of work. But I heard back some very interesting things. They gave valuable insights on the manuscript. But what I heard back, one thing really surprised me, was that a common tool that they used was that these top professors, particularly in STEM, but also in other disciplines would use, is they'd use metaphor and analogy to convey key ideas. Think about it this way. When we're in STEM, we don't like talk to people in the humanities, right? But actually, it's the people in the humanities that give some of these wonderful structures for learning. And by using and kind of interacting in this way and using great metaphor, we're actually bringing in some of the strength and value from the humanities. So as I began working or finishing up this manuscript, I reached out to top neuroscientists, top cognitive psychologists, and I myself have taught for decades in engineering, and I've worked in not only engineering research, but also in educational research. And so what I want to present to you today here is some of the best of what I've found about how we learn effectively. So the brain, as we know, is enormously complicated, but we can simplify its operation into two fundamentally different modes. The first I'll call the focus mode. And focusing is what you do like right now when you're looking at me. It's funny when I speak in Asia, it's like there's this ability to focus that's relentless. So after I've spoken for 2 hours, they're still focusing. I don't even have to tell jokes. It's amazing. But the other mode that we often use is that of what I'll call the diffuse mode. Diffuse mode is actually like a set of mini neural resting states, the most prominent of which is the default mode network. So the diffuse mode might be, it happens when you're thinking of nothing in particular and your mind is just kind of darting around. So like you go in the shower, diffuse mode. You're driving to work, diffuse mode. Going for a walk, maybe going for a jog, riding on a bus, and so forth. Those are all kinds of times when your brain kind of goes into a random, not thinking about anything particular type of thinking. Now, to better understand these two modes, we will use a metaphor. And so the metaphor we're going to use is that of a pinball machine. Now, if you're of a certain age, you will remember how a pinball machine works. All you need to do is pull back on the plunger, a ball goes boinking around on the rubber bumpers, and that's how you get points. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this pinball machine and we're going to put it right there on the human brain. So you can see the brain here. There's the ears, there's the nose, there's the brain. Okay, you ready? Everybody's quiet. Okay. Here we go. Okay, so there's the pinball machine on the brain. And if you look, these rubber bumpers are very close to one another. This is an analogy for the focused mode of thinking. So in focused mode of thinking, you often have patterns that have already been laid. So for example, when I moved to Massachusetts when I was a little kid, I didn't have those multiplication patterns laid yet. And those patterns are they look kind of like, well, you can imagine them as being a real pattern. And when you think a thought, let's say I asked you to multiply 22 times 43, that thought your thoughts move right along the patterns that have already been laid. But what if you are trying to think about something and understand something that you've never encountered before? So let's say you know multiplication really well, but you've never encountered division. It's almost like division is in the pattern isn't even there yet. You don't know how to get to the pattern. You don't know what it is shaped like. You don't even know how to put it there. So how do you get new patterns? How do you learn new things? As it turns out, you often start to grapple with a new idea by going back to what you're familiar with, but it doesn't work. And you're using sort of patterns that don't really work. So that's when I would be stabbing the page of the book. But if you go into that other mode, that diffuse mode, what happens is when you think a thought, it takes off and it can move much more widely. So what this means is this: when you first sit down and you try to work on something and you get stuck, and you get more and more frustrated because, look, you're kind of around here because it's what you know and what you're used to. You need to get here, but you can't because look at all the rubber bumpers in the way. So you get more and more frustrated. You give up. You stomp off maybe in frustration. You go do something else. You get your attention completely off it. And when you do that, you are actually opening access to this other way of thinking, the diffuse mode. You can only be in either focus mode or diffuse mode. You can't be in both at the same time. So as long as you're in this mode, you're trying really hard to solve the problem, but you're actually blocking your ability to look at the big picture and kind of move into a new position where you can begin to solve that problem. Now, I guess Well, there is one time when you can be in focused and diffuse mode at the same time. And I wouldn't suggest it because it involves the use of mushrooms and so forth. But there's some interesting research about that. But anyway, so the thing is, when people are learning, they often need to go back and forth between those two modes. And so they learn, they struggle, then they have to kind of step back and look at the big picture and make sense of it using this diffuse mode. We often think that we're only learning when we're focusing, but there's learning taking place in the background, even when we're going off for a walk and so forth, after we've focused intently. So what I'd like you to do now is I'd like you to team up, and I'd like you to explain to one another, take 2 minutes here, and explain the difference to one another between focused and diffuse modes. So on your mark, get set, 2 minutes, go. So let's see, I overheard one conversation a little bit, so I think John had an interesting perspective, so maybe we can ask John to share just a wee bit here.
Well, what I saw was that if you have the focus mode, you have a scaffolding that you've pre-erected in your brain to learn particular subjects, and that you're bringing things in to try and relate to what's on the scaffolding. And if that works, that's great because it's reinforcing what you already know. But if things don't work, then you have to back off and you have to see if you've got something else in your brain that relates to it. And can I then find a new part of scaffolding in my brain that would work? So.
Right. I love this way of explaining because it also alludes to something that we're going to speak about a little bit later in this talk. Any other comments? Questions? Everybody happy? You're happy because there's rain today, right? I guess there hasn't been rain for a while. So, okay. So the thing is, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, you know, we got another one of these people who come in here and tell us how to do all this stuff, and they actually have no idea what we really face as professors, right, as teachers and instructors. Because my students, for example, they're not going to, you know, like focus and then take a break and go off and learn, and I certainly can't do that really in classes. And besides, behind all of this is something that all of my students love to do, and that is to procrastinate. So as it turns out, procrastination is such an important part of why we learn and why we don't learn that it's worth spending a minute or two talking about it. Now, as it turns out, when we're trying to learn, right, and we are even thinking about something we don't like, right? So let's say we don't want to do our homework, or we don't want to, you know, we don't like doing our taxes, or anything that we don't like. It turns out that that actually activates a portion of the brain that experiences pain. And the brain, naturally enough, looks to stop that negative stimulation. So here's what it does. Now remember, procrastination's just a habit. So often what you'll do is you'll think, let's see, grade tests. Oh no, right? And so what you do is you turn your attention to something else, and the result is that you feel happier almost instantly. Now you do this once, you do it twice, it's really no big deal. But if you do it very often, if you make it a big habit, it can have severe long-term consequences on your life. And many students actually suffer from procrastination and its after effects, because all you have to do is put it off until the last minute, then you don't do very well in the test, and you think it's just, I have no knack for this subject, when it has nothing to do with whether or not you have a knack for the subject. It's actually whether or not you've had the time to learn the material. So since I'm an engineer, I'm just going to cut right to the chase. How do you tackle procrastination? The best way is using a technique called the Pomodoro technique. Who here has heard of the Pomodoro technique? One person? Come on. more. Oh, you're going to love this. I have to say, okay, so my co-instructor is Terry Sinowski. He's the Francis Crick professor at the Salk Institute. And he, so the MOOC that we teach, the Massive Open Online Course, has almost 1.7 million registered students now. And so we hear a lot from these students, like a lot. And one of the things that they love the most is this Pomodoro technique. They find it very effective. So that, along with focused and diffused, and with what you're going to hear about, which is chunking. Now, Pomodoro technique was invented by Francesco Cirillo in the 1980s, and Pomodoro stands for it's Italian for tomato. And what you do, this is so simple. First, all you have to do is, turn off your cell phone or any alarms from your cell phone, so no buzzes, no nothing. And then, and likewise on your computer, you'll have these little messages that will pop up. That should all go off. And for any kind of productivity work, you want to make sure you have any messages like that on your computer so that they don't pop up. But then you just take a timer and you set it for 25 minutes. It can be any timer. It can just be a little tabletop timer. Or for me, I've downloaded a timer and I just have it on my desktop of my computer. Or many people really like the apps that are Pomodoro apps, and there are hundreds and hundreds of them. And some people collect them, so they'll do like maybe 2 Pomodoros on one subject, 3 on another. So you might say, well, what's a Pomodoro? That is, you set that for 25 minutes, and then you just focus for 25 minutes. And the reality is, anybody can focus for 25 minutes. Now, if you're human, like me, you'll do things like this. You'll do maybe 5 minutes. So you do 5 minutes, and then you look at the timer, and you've only done 5 minutes. And my mind will go, I can't do another 20 minutes. And I let that thought go right on by, because the whole idea is not to be perfect in the Pomodoro, but to, whenever you catch yourself, to just let the thought go by and return your focus to what you're working on. And when you're done, and this is perhaps the most important part of the Pomodoro, you give yourself a little reward. That reward can be anything. It can be, do you like to listen to a certain song? Listen to the song as your reward. You can go off and get a cup of coffee, go to Facebook, chat with friends, anything that allows your mind to go to something different, right? You turn your attention away from what you've been looking at. And you now understand, remember, people always used to think it's only when you're focusing that you're learning. But actually, this relaxation period, that reward period, it's kind of like you take something out of the oven, right, a turkey, and you let it sit for 10 minutes or so because it's still cooking, and that's what that diffuse mode is doing during that time. So the only other little tip I can give you is don't focus on actually finishing a task. So don't sit down and think, during this 25 minutes, I'm going to finish the entire homework set. No, you're not. By thinking about that, remember what you're doing is sparking that pain in the brain that makes it uncomfortable. So you're kind of tricking your brain. You're not actually directly thinking about what you're going to do. You're just doing it. And that can be much less painful. There is some interesting dynamic behind this whole Pomodoro idea. And that is that, remember the pain in the brain that occurs. As it turns out, that pain, if you do neuroimaging studies, it dissipates after 20 minutes of work on the topic. Well, 25 minutes gets you past that point. So you start to get into the flow of things. Also, 25 minutes is like just a little less than half an hour, and it feels pretty doable. Now, the thing is, learning well is kind of like baking a cake. There's lots and lots of different ingredients that are very important for that cake. So another important ingredient for learning is sleep. And I know you're thinking, that's a snooze. We knew that already. Ha ha. Okay, so the thing is, you may have known that sleep was important, but you didn't know why. And when you don't know why, you miss some of the important aspects of sleep. I've known doctoral students who go without sleep the night before their qualifying exams because they think they're going to learn more effectively. I mean, it's kind of silly, but people do these kinds of things because they don't understand why sleep is important. Now, the thing is, when you are this is my metaphor for neurons, right? So we've got these little round neurons here. And what happens is during the day, so we've got you before it's too late in the day, but as the day goes by and it starts to get towards evening, these little metabolites come out of the cells. And that's what gives you that sort of feeling of weariness as the day goes by. But it turns out you think, there's all these cerebral fluids. Why don't they wash those metabolites away? They can't, because these neurons are kind of big. They're like boulders that are in the path of the cerebral fluid, so the metabolites can't be washed out. But when you go to sleep, your brain cells shrink. I love this part, so I'm going to do it again. Okay, so when you go to sleep, your brain cells shrink, and that allows the fluids to wash those toxins away. So that's part of why you feel refreshed when you get up in the morning. So that's part of why sleep is important, but it's not the only reason why sleep is important. So if you look here, there's this fantastic new technique called light microscopy. And with this technique, you can image living neurons. So this is a living neuron before learning and before sleep. And this is the exact same neuron after learning and after sleep. And if you look, see these little yellow triangles? That's where new synaptic connections have formed. So what this means is when you go to sleep at night, that's when the neural architecture that underpins new learning is forming. So that's why it's so important to space learning out, to do some every day, rather than to cram it all in one day like before a test. Because if you do that, you can only grow so many synaptic connections in an evening, right? And so it just forms sort of a weak pattern, and then your little metabolic vampires can more easily suck those patterns away. By analogy or a metaphor is that when you're trying to lay a good foundation, you want to lay the bricks, but make sure that the mortar has time to dry between the layers. If you don't do that, what happens is kind of a big jumble, right? So there's yet another aspect of learning that's very important, and we often don't think about this. Your student may come up to you and say, I'm just so anxious. I can't really focus when I'm studying. What do I do? And what do you say? Do you say anything? Right? Exercise. Exercise is powerfully important in helping people maintain a focus when they are trying to study. We often kind of disconnect our physical bodies from the idea of learning, and we forget the fact that exercise is one of the most powerful potentiators of good learning. Even a few days of an exercise program, that you can see, and research has shown, people show a remarkable difference in their ability to learn and to remember. We used to think that you were born with all the neurons you ever had, would have, and they sort of gradually would die off, and then you get older and your neurons are dying off and you kind of get dumber and then you die, and it was so depressing, and so fortunately it's all completely wrong. Now we understand that new neurons are being born every day, particularly in the hippocampus, which is an important area of the brain for learning and memory. What is the best way to spark new neurons growing and surviving and thriving? Turns out it's exercise. Exercise does a lot of different things, but one of the factors it gives is BDNF, and that's like this brain fertilizer that helps new neurons to spark and survive and thrive. So this is kind of an older study from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and it shows a mouse being taught to differentiate between these two patterns. And if you look, these blue blobs signify old neurons. The red ones are new neurons. And when the mouse exercises, they not only get lots more new neurons, but they can learn the difference between those patterns much more quickly. So we now have a lot more research on humans that shows precisely the same sort of thing. But I bring this up because you can't really quite see it here, but I can. Here's Terence Sanowski, and he is my co-instructor in the MOOC. And Terry is one of only 10 living human beings who is simultaneously a member of all 3 national academies. So he is a genius. And so I'm always like totally intimidated when I go to visit. Hello, what do you say to a genius, right? So what I said last time we visited, we're out filming the MOOC. And so Terry's talking away about, the importance of exercise, because he's done a lot of this research and he knows how important it actually is. So I can't help but ask him, I'm like, Terry, so tell me, do you exercise? And Terry's like, do I exercise? Do I exercise? Next thing you know, here he is, he's 68, scrambles down that cliff, and this is what he does every other day or so. He goes for a run on the beach, and sometimes I'll show like the contrast. Here's Terry. Oh, I love how this ends up. Yeah. Sometimes I show the contrast. Me going to my day job, so I'm shoveling out the snow in my driveway, and he's going for the run on the beach, right? So MOOCs and online learning are really a great way to interact with faculty in a whole new way. But there's another aspect, again, that we should touch on, and this one is probably one of the most important aspects of learning, but it's all too neglected, and it relates to memory. Now, for simplification purposes of this talk, I'm going to talk about only 2 types of memory. One is working memory, which is kind of like short-term memory, and long-term memory. Now, working memory, we used to think that people could hold 7 items in their working memory, sort of like 7 slots in working memory. But now we know it's probably more like 4 items in working memory. And for me, in the morning before I have had my coffee, it is 2 slots if I'm lucky, right? But the thing is, so what you can do is you can kind of imagine that when you turn your attention on something, it's like the octopus of attention, and it can reach down into working memory and make connections between some of the different things that you remember and kind of put them together. Now, as you're learning or as you're focusing on something, though, here's an interesting aspect. So you've got those slots of working memory. If you are distracted, so let's say you're looking at the book, but you've got the television kind of going on in the background, that kind of removes some aspects of your working memory, like taking away a slot, and so you're less effective. In some ways, you're kind of dumber, right? So that's why it's important often to try and really focus on what you're trying to do. You will be surprised with your students. They will often come up and say things like this: I worked for 10 hours yesterday. I just don't understand how I could flunk this test. Well, for one thing, you want to ask them, why were you working for 10 hours yesterday instead of all the way along, right? But often, too, those 10 hours, they're really not focused intently for 10 hours. They're doing other things, too. And so that really is not as effective. So by contrast, here's an image of the diffuse mode. So it's kind of, notice it's sort of random connections, you don't have an octopus of attention controlling things. So how do you get things from working memory into long-term memory? Well, as it turns out, practice really does, if not make completely permanent, it super helps. So what it does is it makes these synaptic connections, it sort of potentiates them, it starts to create patterns. And these patterns, at first they're kind of weak, but the more you practice and repeat, the deeper and richer they grow. So this finally brings us to one of the key points of this talk, and that is the idea of chunking. Now, when you look at a problem and you're trying to understand it, or a new concept that you're trying to internalize, your working memory is going a little bonkers, right? And you can actually see it in neuroimaging. It's really, there's lots of metabolic activity that's taking place there. But once you have really internalized a concept, so you understand it, then it's almost like this. You have created this sort of chunk that you can draw into working memory whenever you want, but you still have aspects of working memory free. So this is why, see, sometimes students will, have you ever had students come up to you and say, I suffer from test anxiety, right? Occasionally? Who? Okay. So I've certainly had that. Now what happens is, I do a lot of active learning in my class. So I have students working in teams, and what they'll often do is they have to evaluate one another. And what I've found over the years is something very interesting. Every student who has ever come up to me and said, I suffer from test anxiety, has also been told, mentioned by their team as someone who never does homework, never shows up for group work, and so forth. Now, test anxiety definitely exists. I know I suffered from it, and it's very possible to suffer from it. But we've also given sort of an easy excuse to students who actually don't study well, because what happens is, if you haven't really studied the material, you look at the test for the first time, and your brain is in this mode, right? It's not in this mode where you just draw up the idea and then you've got free aspects of working memory to work with. And so be very wary. If a student comes up to you and says, I suffer from test anxiety, that's why I'm not doing well on your tests, start asking them, what are your study habits? How well do you really analyze the material? Do you practice with quiz questions? Do you practice with homework questions? We often give homework assignments out. Student will do it one time, turn it back in. Would you ever sing a song one time and think you knew that song? A good homework problem, you can't do this with every homework problem, but the key ones, and the key example problems, the student should take it and see if they can independently work it, and then work it again without looking at the solution, and then see if they can work it the next day, and the next, so that it's like practicing, and eventually they should be able to look at that problem and pull the solution up in their mind just as if it were a song. Now, I'll give you an example. Okay, so this is our younger daughter. So you might say, so we created the MOOC, Learning How to Learn, mostly in our basement. And so it's, for less than $5,000. And how would you ever do a MOOC for less than $5,000? Well, simple. Whenever you need actresses and stuff, I would use my family members. So for this one, I needed somebody to model backing up a car really badly. So I asked my daughters, and my younger daughter's like, Mom, I can do that, right? So what she's doing here, watch her little face, and what she's doing is modeling what it feels like the first time you ever back up a car. Now notice how she's kind of, she's looking at the mirror. She's looking, which way do you look? Wait, no, she's going the wrong way. Okay, let's try, and she still ends up in the ditch. Okay, so that is what it feels like when you're first trying to back up a car. Your brain, you haven't got this idea of backing up a car chunked. And so you have all this input, you don't know what to do, your brain is a little overloaded, but once you learn how to back up a car, all you have to do is think the thought, I'm going to back up a car. And not only can you back up the car, but you can also be talking to your friend, listening to music, so you've got other parts of working memory free. It's not just backing up a car, of course. Chunking is important for any kind of learning, whether you're learning how to play soccer, you're learning to play the piano, or you're learning a foreign language, or you're learning in math and science. All too often, unfortunately, we've long had this sense where practice and repetition kills your creativity, and that nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, what experts have found that the common aspect of all expertise is that they have a good, solid library of chunks. And those chunks can be instantly drawn to mind, and then connections can be made so that, for example, if you have something a little different on tests, you can sort of really put things together on the fly because you've got room in your brain to be able to do that. Now, I did, one time a student came up to me and said, you know, look at this test. And he shows me his test, and it's all marked with red stuff, and he'd flunked it. He goes, I can't believe I flunked this test. I understood it when you said it in class. We've gotten so overboard on the idea that conceptual understanding is the only path to learning well, that we've thrown the baby out with the bathwater. You can understand, you can kind of get a glimmer of things when somebody says it in class, but until you practice with it, you'll never internalize and master it. So this is why practice and repetition, along with understanding, is so critical. So there's yet another aspect of learning that I want to touch on here that I think is really important, and that is that we often think people's best traits are really awful. I'll give you an example of this. So let's take poor memory. We think poor memory is a bad thing, right? I mean, who wouldn't want to have a really, really good memory? Now, as it turns out, people who have a poor memory, it's kind of like, you remember those 4 slots of working memory that I spoke of? Well, some people have a steel trap memory. They can just, they got it, they've got it all, right? And their working memory is really good, and it allows them to learn quickly in class and so forth, and just to remember what's going on. But some people have memories, working memories that are kind of like, I had those 4 things in working memory. Oh, shiny! I got distracted. So something falls out. But when something falls out, something else comes in, and that new coming in is something creative. That's where creativity comes from, and research has shown that people who have poor working memories are often more creative. So do they have to work harder and longer and be more persistent in order to kind of keep up with the Joneses, the people who have better working memories? Absolutely, they do need to do that, but the trade-off is that they are more creative, and that's often a trade-off they would never want to give up. Now there's another type of learner. In my classrooms, I'll sometimes experience the student with the race car brain. You know, I ask a question that's so hard that I kind of barely catch it myself, and there's somebody in the front row, they've already got their hand up, they've got it figured out. And those people have like race car brains, they can think so quickly. And other people have sort of more like hiker brains. They can get to the same destination, but they're a lot slower. But think about the hiker. What the hiker and the race car driver experience are completely different. Race car, everything goes by in a whiz. Hiker, they can actually see the pine needles. They they can reach out and touch them. They can see the little rabbit trails. They can hear the birds. They can even smell the pine in the air. Completely different experience, and in some ways far richer and deeper. So my hero in science is a fellow by the name of Santiago Ramon y Cajal. He won the Nobel Prize. He's considered the father of modern neuroscience. And what Ramon y Cajal said was, I am no genius. And he wasn't. He said, I've worked with geniuses, but I'm no genius. He said, I got to where I am because I am persistent, and when I made a hypothesis about what was there, and it was wrong, that when I found out, I tested it all out, and it was wrong, I could flexibly change my mind in the face of data that said I was wrong. He said, the geniuses that I've worked with, geniuses, incidentally, who did not win the Nobel Prize, they often they were really, really smart. So they didn't want to take time to actually learn about all this stuff. I mean, they're really smart, so they just kind of figured they knew it. They would jump to conclusions, and they're so used to being right that they couldn't change their mind when they were wrong, and they just keep going with whatever they had initially presumed. So if you are a slow learner, or if your students are slow learners, rejoice. This is not necessarily a bad thing. It can be a very, very good thing. This young woman here, Miriam Mirzakhani, won the Fields Medal, and that is like the Nobel Prize for math. And she was told as a young woman that she thought too slowly to ever be a mathematician, but now she's widely acknowledged as one of the most creative mathematicians alive. Now, as we're wrapping up, I'd just like to bring up just a few points about illusions of competence in learning. Your students will often fool themselves about what they're doing and whether it's effective. So the best way to help your students is to test. Test every time you can, all the time. So, for example, for me, every time I go into class, I give my students a test. So they just love it when I go out of town. But they found that 1 hour of testing, as opposed to 1 hour of just sitting there and studying, you will learn far more during that 1 hour of testing. It really does concentrate the mind and provides kind of a motivation for study as well. So another thing is to remember that flashcard kinds of things with the practice and repetition really are your friend. Now, for centuries, for millennia really, people have always thought that memorization really was the heart of learning. And so if you could just memorize, that meant you could learn something. Of course, that's not true. So in the last 50 years, unfortunately, the baby has been thrown out with the bathwater. We've gone the complete other way. As long as you understand something, you don't need to memorize anything, right? Understanding is enough, but that's not true either. Good learning involves a mixture of some memorization and some practice and making sure that you understand things. So poets, for example, will often say, memorize the poem and you will understand it more deeply. But why should we let the poets have all the fun, right? If you work in a STEM subject, a little bit of memorization of key equations is a really good thing. It will help internalize some of the material. What I often do is something that I call a 3-minute quiz. So I'll tell them at the end of the last class, okay, the next 3-minute quiz will be this equation, and maybe a little simplistic application of it, a question that has a simplistic application. And this has to be, so the next class period, at the very beginning of class, like tick, okay, it's the moment class begins, I say, okay, paper, put everything away, 3-minute quiz. Okay, write the equation, and I might have a little problem for them. And what this does is, it makes them memorize a little bit each day, right? So each class day, they have to memorize a tiny bit, get a tiny bit of something simple to practice. It also does 2 other things. It gets them to class on time, right? And finally, I always try, unless I'm in a class of 800 or something like that, if I have a class of up to around 60 to 70, I will try to memorize students' names. And you may think, wow, why would I bother to do that? But the thing is, what they've found is there is the one common factor of students staying enrolled in school or in a university is that one faculty member knew their name. So when I do the 3-minute quizzes, that's also my little opportunity to walk around and check their names, right? Because I'm practicing and repeating with names. So it does a lot of good on that front. Now, the last thing I want to bring up as a great learning tool is recall. Recall is actually a form of testing. So you want your students to be testing themselves all the time. But recall is a great way of learning, and what that means is if you have a page that you're trying to learn or your students are trying to learn, what you want to do is, what your tendency to do is this: reread it, right? Or maybe underline it, right? Because if you move the pencil on the page or the yellow marker on the page, doesn't that mean that it's going in your brain automatically? It has that feeling, doesn't it? But research has shown that just looking at the page, looking away and seeing if you can recall the main point is the most effective way to learn the material on that page. It's even better than concept mapping. So it's better than concept mapping, rereading, underlining, and so forth. Just look at the page, look away, and see what you can recall. So in closing, I'd like to allude to the idea of passion. We're often told, follow our passions, right? And we tell students, follow your passion. But passions are a double-edged sword. Passions develop about what we're good at, and some things take much longer to get good at. So I always say, don't just follow your passions, broaden your passions, and your lives will be greatly enriched. Thank you so much. Any questions? Everybody happy? You're doing some diffuse mode here. Yes?
In relating back to your discussion about recall and testing and giving a 3-minute exam at the beginning of class, I think there's several in here that do distance education, so that becomes more difficult. Do you have insight on how you can encourage distance students to use that same type of strategy?
Okay, so I teach, that's a very good question. I teach online courses, sort of smaller online courses, as well as the MOOC. So what I often do for those is there's a couple of different things. I'll often put in a little, like a little label that'll pop up, and it'll say something like, this equation's really important. Put it on your mirror, right? And whenever I have a really important equation, and I'll say, oh, this is a mirror equation. And the idea is to put it on a sticky note and then put it on the mirror so that they'll see it all the time. So as I'll speak about this afternoon, I also, I think that's about the best you can do, is to encourage in that way, because memorization is so important, yet it's something that we can't really test for too effectively, other than to have very short questions or time frames for questions. Now, students can sometimes cheat on online sorts of things. The way I often handle this, which may or may not be doable for you, is that I'll often, when they do come in, like I might see them for the final or for a midterm, then I will substitute their in-class grades for their online grades for quizzes. So if their online grades are really high, but their in-person grades are not that high, then it gets lowered, and it's sort of a motivator to actually really learn the material. So I'm not sure if that might work or might not work for you. But it just, I think encouraging memorization is a big step forward, because often students hear, you can always look it up, you don't need to memorize. But if instead they hear from professors, this is important to memorize, and practice it, I think that can be helpful. Very good question. Okay, more questions?
One follow-up on that. Do you think in the online environment in particular, where it is really self-motivated by the student, putting in some type of competency assessment, so maybe they're doing a pre-test to see where their initial knowledge is, and then in the online environment, then there is this post-test, but you don't get to move forward to the next thing until you've mastered that content?
Right.
I mean, that's kind of a way to help this, but it's more of that gaming aspect too, where the students need to have competency over this material, since you're not seeing them face to face and you don't always have those assessment pieces.
You are so far ahead of a lot of university administrators and instructors who don't realize the power of online learning. One of the real sources of power is mastery learning. In other words, a student can flunk it, and then keep retaking it until they actually pass it. And I mean, not by luck and but actually they had to learn the material to pass. And I think that's one of the great power of online learning. It saddens me sometimes, because you'll look at a university, and for example, a university I know is putting $90 million into new dormitories, and they wouldn't put $100,000 into or even $10,000 into creating good online coursework. And yet, if we could create, it's within grasp to create great quiz materials and so forth that will kind of reconfigure themselves automatically. It's just not usually it's not usually doable by one professor alone. And you kind of need a group to create these kinds of things. But I think that is the future, is we're going to be moving into mastery learning, and more universities will gradually figure out that it is worth their while to create these good mastery learning quizzes. Now, what is on the horizon that I think is also really interesting is the facial recognition that is in airports at present will inevitably be coming to online learning. And I think one of the challenges we've had about spreading online learning is, how do you know that the student is really taking the materials? Well, with this, nothing is ever untrickable, but it's much more difficult. And I think that will cause a kind of a whole new look at the value of online learning. The reality is that there can be such a great cost savings for students, and the universities that are smart enough to take advantage of this can do courses at great scale, and its scale is where you can really, the university can do well, the students benefit as well. It's a win-win for everybody. Dan.
Barbara, I'm curious, as you have developed the MOOC, and we had the joy of having dinner last night, and you said you're working on scripts of other MOOCs and so on and so forth. Having had that experience and reflecting and investing even more, I'm curious if you had to identify the top 2 or 3 changes it's made to you, or it's affected you in the way that you teach, the experience of working in that large-scale kind of MOOC environment?
I think the biggest change for me is I had no idea how big the world was before. It's kind of good and bad, but like I would work really, really, really hard to create a class for 30 students, say, and now I'm beginning to realize that with not much more effort, I can create that same class for, 30 million students. And this is not to be, well, it is to be a little bit scare-inducing, because what this means is that as a face-to-face instructor, you better up your game, because it's really important. And you can do things in the in-person classroom that cannot be done in online, and you better strengthen that. The reality is that half of all professors are below average. So, you know, a reasonably good MOOC is going to be way better than a bad professor. So we always think, oh, online learning, that's, you know, it's not going to be as good as face-to-face, but actually it can be better. But I think for you in this room, if you're doing an online course, think bigger. I mean, you can benefit your university, you can benefit the students, and it is so creative what you can do with an online course. And it's such a great benefit for everyone concerned. So, you know, I guess that's the big thing for me. Also, I think seeing the benefits that the online world can bring for students. And what I often have seen before, well, it's just so darn exciting. There's just so much opportunity. And this is the same time frame when Microsoft was coming out and Apple was just coming out, and you know, they were just going and doing computers. And people who figured out the advantage that the web could bring, that they got into the forefront. We're at that stage right now with online learning. So those who become, you know, really good at it, you're really going to benefit, I think, in the long run. Other questions? Shall I tell you? Okay. So before we go, okay. I should just tell you, the very, very first day I ever taught a class, okay, and so I was so incredibly nervous, and I was being evaluated as to whether I was going to be given a tenure track position, right? And so they asked me to teach this class, Statics and Dynamics, which I'd taken 15 years before and done horribly at, right? And so I was just this wreck, but I thought, you know, I can only do this one time in my entire life, and so I might as well do it now. So I walked into class, and I said, hello, I am not teaching English, I'm not understanding English, I'm teaching statics and dynamics. And then I made like I was so nervous, which was like totally easy to do, that I forgot how to write in English, and I wrote my name in Cyrillic on the board, you know. And I turned around, they're all getting their ad drop cards out. So, so I said, I gotcha, didn't I? And it worked out so great. So I was a horrible wreck as a professor, but they forgave me everything. So if I can leave you with one comment, it's just don't forget humor in your teaching, and especially in your online teaching. So thank you so much.